LBC. From Global, leading Britain's conversation. This is Cross Question.
Good evening, I'm Ali Miraj. You're listening to LBC. This is Cross Question. Joining me on the panel this evening are Rachel Shabi on my left, the journalist and author who always speaks a lot of sense. I'm sure you've heard her many, many times. Delighted to have her in the studio this evening. David Simmonds, Conservative MP for Ruislip, Northwood and Pinner, also an executive member of the 1922 committee, and he's not wearing a grey suit. It's a blue one. I'm very disappointed, David. And also Alex Phillips, policy advisor for Reform UK and former MEP for the Brexit Party. We don't have Siobhan McDonough, but that gives more space for us to talk about many, many things with our panellists tonight. And you might want to ask our panellists about Prince Harry claiming that both the press and the government are at rock bottom. Is he right? Should he really be making a comment like that anyway? Members of the business lobby group, the CBI, overwhelmingly backing its plans to reform from its sexual misconduct scandal, the suspension of an MP who broke COVID lockdown rules, which is set to trigger a by-election battle between the new SNP leader Humza Yousaf and the resurgent Scottish Labour Party. And if there's anything else that you want to talk about, you're very welcome to ask them. You might even want to ask them about the new houses being constructed in May being at the lowest level since the first lockdown began. Anything else on your mind, feel free to ask our panel. And don't forget you can watch us on Global Player as well. Or 0345 6060 973 or text 84850.
973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross Question. Watch on Global Player. This is LBC.
OK, so let's get cracking with Hassan is Westminster with our first question. Hassan, what would you like to ask?
Yeah, hi. My question was, Jamie Driscoll, the mayor for North of Tyne, has been blocked by the Labour Central Office from standing again to defend the seat that he won because he shared a platform with Ken Loach, the legendary sort of filmmaker and anti-racism campaigner. So should Jamie run as an independent if he's been blocked to stand?
OK, so the question is, should Jamie Driscoll, the Labour mayor, being prevented from standing again, becoming an independent candidate? Should he be allowed to, should he be prevented from standing again? Jamie Driscoll is currently the mayor of the North of Tyne Combined Authority. He's been excluded from the list of possible candidates for the new larger role of the mayor of the North East. He's been described as the last Corbynista standing in the Labour Party. Well, I've got to come to Rachel Shabi first on this one. Rachel.
Well, first of all, I think it's absolutely shocking and appalling that he's been blocked from standing. That goes against the natural democratic processes that the party has. The idea that, you know, a central committee in London will decide on behalf of another part of the country who they can even select, never mind who they would have, just goes completely against any Labour Party claims to be trying to democratise and increase the democracy and connect people to politics. Secondly, the idea that someone like Jamie Driscoll or anyone else should be guilty by association, I think we can call that McCarthyist. Because what has Jamie Driscoll done? Actually, he's been on a platform with a filmmaker to discuss a film about the north of England, a new film. You would think that would be very pertinent to his constituents, who he serves very well and among whom he's very popular, by the way. The idea that someone in politics should not be able to stand next to someone else and then be guilty by association. And can you imagine the hundreds and thousands of people that politicians stand next to and share panels with on a regular basis as part of the job? It's absolute outrage. It's factional. It's using anti-Semitism as a political tool. Nobody who really wants to tackle anti-Semitism would do so in this way.
What is the actual specific issue? It's the fact that he shared a platform with Ken Loach, who's the filmmaker. Is that the fundamental issue here?
Well, that's the thing. It's very hard to say. It's very hard to see because there's such a lack of transparency about this process. So I don't think officially that was the reason given. However, we've seen many briefings from friends and allies of the leadership that was indeed the case. If it is the case, they should just come out and say it, and then we can have that conversation. But it's the opacity that I think is fueling part of the problem. And, nobody wants to be accused of being a racist or an anti-Semite. And I think just the whiff of it, just the association of it is so damning and can have such a chill factor that people just don't know what to say for fear of being tarred with the same brush. And again, anyone who wanted to tackle anti-Semitism would not do it in that way. Nobody genuinely interested in the issue would tackle it like this.
I think, obviously, you could argue, couldn't you, Alex Phillips, that Keir Starmer is very sensitive about that issue of anti-Semitism.
I think what's going on here is the Labour Party, for the first time in a very long time, can sense an election victory on the horizon, and they are really enforcing what they believe is their own internal party discipline. They want to get the right people in the right seats to maximise on the potential they have to actually take the next election. I can't comment on the decision-making process in the Labour Party. I've never been involved with it. But what strikes me, actually, is if Jamie Driscoll has built up a huge personal following, then there's a big risk to the Labour Party. If he does run, actually it's going to potentially split their vote. We live in an open democracy. Anybody with the right amount of support and a deposit has the entitlement to stand up and say, I want to represent a voice in my community. And so it's up to Jamie Driscoll now if he chooses to do that. And in many respects, it might be a test of his own party loyalty, whether he's going to say, OK, fine, they've made a strategic decision based on whatever reason that they have chosen. And actually me running could potentially prevent them taking a critical seat. Of course, the northeast of England is critical for the Labour Party. A lot of the red wall was taken by the Conservatives in the last election. And so he's got a big decision to make now, whether he wants to potentially risk his party having that seat, or whether he thinks that I'm here to represent people who back me, who like me, and who I'm doing a good job for. So,
but isn't it slightly different, Alex Phillips, the difference between standing as a mayoral candidate and standing in seats for Parliament? I mean, is it different? I mean, Ken Livingstone comes to mind when he had that big fallout when Labour was putting up Frank Dobson in the first mayoral election for London, and he fell out. He decided to stand himself and won 2 elections after that.
Yeah, I mean, there is a difference in many respects with what the role entails. And in some respects, the mayoral position is very much an ambassadorial position as well. You become a big figurehead for the region, and fighting in a constituency on a party political basis is indeed very different. But at the end of the day, it is a democracy. And if somebody wants to represent where they're from or where they represent, then it should be open for them to do so. I think the big question now is if he chooses to go down that route.
Now, David, you've got a lot of experience of local government. Before you came into Parliament, you were Deputy Leader of Hillingdon Council, so you understand the local politics and the vicissitudes of local politics extremely well. What do you think Jamie Driscoll should do in this particular situation?
Clearly, he's going to have to make a decision about what his next steps are. Like others, I'd say the decision itself is an internal matter for the Labour Party. Conservatives don't really have a strong view about that. There's been some positive feedback about the work that he's done as an elected mayor in this context. But clearly, as Alex has described, the Labour Party is facing an issue. It's seeking to put its house in order. They've got a number of characters they've got to deal with. There's been a suggestion, for example, that Jeremy Corbyn might decide to run in the London mayoral election, having been excluded from being a Labour candidate in his own constituency. All of those things will have an impact on the Labour Party's prospects of capturing seats that it hopes. And of course, from my party's perspective, we'd rather like that to happen. We'd like to see those people who are well-known figures in their community standing on an alternative platform. But clearly, we need to kind of recognise the fact. I think we're all spectators to this.
Can you understand, David, from the perspective of the Labour leadership, that they want to maintain, I mean, Alex talked about the election coming out, cast iron discipline ahead of that election because it is within their sights so they potentially could win, and they don't want to take any chances?
But they've clearly got a long way to travel, and we've seen the well-documented problems they've had, even within their Labour parliamentary party, that Keir Starmer and his colleagues have been trying to deal with. And I think we recognise any party that hopes to win an election needs to demonstrate that it's united, that it's got a clear, consistent plan for government, and they've got a long way to travel before they can convince the public of that.
Hassan, quick comment from you on what you've heard from the panel.
Look, I think I really liked Rachel's view. I think this is essentially about, do you want local people to decide who their candidates are, or do you want to parachute in people who have no credibility from a centre office? And I think one of the pledges that Starmer had made, one of the many pledges that he's abandoned, is that he would bring empower the local electors. So he's going back on this pledge. And I think there is a real risk that people like Jamie, people like Corbyn and others could actually stand on their own and win or split the vote.
Rachel, I mean, do you think that's a fair point that Hassan's making? That, I mean, if that was to happen, that would be an absolute disaster for the Labour Party, wouldn't it? I mean, they would completely backfire this tactic.
It might backfire in that it would give them a lot of unwanted attention on that issue rather than what they want to present ahead of an election in a campaign. But I do think, we have to look at a much wider point here when we look at this is part of a pattern for Labour. And so when we look at the selection for parliamentary candidates that's taken place over the last year, you look at the kind of people who've been blocked, again, for factional reasons, the kind of people, the quality of people, very local community organisers, trade union organisers, people who really are part of the community, of the constituency that they seek to serve. Now, for Labour to say, we don't give a stuff about that, what message is that sending to people whose votes they are seeking in the next election?
But is that any different, Rachel, to what would have happened under Blair when it was also quite tightly controlled as well?
Well, it's interesting you say that.
Message discipline, isn't it?
It's really interesting you say that because I've spoken with a lot of people about this.
Right.
And so many have said, look, I've been around politics for decades. Blair was nothing like this. This is so much worse than Blair. Blair wasn't as threatened by the left, and he actually didn't seek to, expel and purge to the same extent, as we can see, because we have quite a few left MPs in Westminster today that are a legacy of those years.
Alex, let me just ask you, because you've obviously had experience of a number of different parties in the sense that you were in UKIP, you've also in the Brexit Party, you've also been in the Conservatives. You've seen how different parties address the issue of discipline. Do you have sympathy with the Labour leadership on this?
Well, what struck me during the course of this conversation is the fact that what you have in a two-party system dictated by first past the post is what I call a sort of corporatisation of political parties, where they say, we're going to be a broad church, but somehow they've got to bring all of these various factions together. The Conservatives have had this through the Liz Truss period, and before that, of course, over Brexit. The Labour Party are now having this when it comes to the more socialist wing and the centrist wing. And what we're seeing now is both parties drifting back towards the centre, which opens up the space on either flank, and we could be up for another political ruction very soon. I mean, if you want, I think, really proportionate representation, then you need to open the field out to other parties, and then you'd end up having parties standing for ideological purposes and not doing the whole party-first idea, which is why I think it becomes a sort of corporate machine. It thinks about the business before it thinks about what it wants to deliver.
It's interesting you mention about there could be another ruction, because the ruction happened with Brexit, but the party system still survived. So that realignment's still going on, but there hasn't been really the emergence of a big third party. You could say the Liberal Democrats coming back a bit, but it's not as if Reform UK or the Brexit Party really acquired that many seats.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that is due to the fact we have a first-past-the-post system, and so the idea is, what is the point in giving these other entities attention when electorally they're not going to make any significant breakthrough? I do think that there's still a few cards to play, certainly by my party, and let's see if that happens. But, when you read certain texts that have come out lately, Matt Goodwin's latest book, where he talks about this disconnect between the public and the established parties, it's very clear to me out there, people are very discontented. They don't really see themselves reflected either in the Labour Party or the Conservative Party, which always happens when they start congregating in that middle ground. So I think the appetite is there to diversify.
Well, we do hear that a lot from listeners as well, that many people at the moment feel politically homeless. So I think it's a fair point to make. So if you'd like to ask our panel on Cross Question a question this evening, you know what to do. The number is 03456 60973. You can text on 84850. You can ask Alexa very politely to send a comment to LBC. You're listening to Cross Question on LBC. It's 8:17.
This is LBC. Cross Question on LBC.
You're listening to Cross Question with Ali Miraj and the panel, which comprises Rachel Shabi, the journalist and author, David Simmonds, the Conservative MP for Ruislip, Northwood and Pinner, and Alex Phillips, policy advisor for Reform UK and a former Brexit MEP. A text question has come in from Albert in Croydon. Do the panel think Prince Harry is just being vindictive against the media and using every opportunity to have a go at them? To a little bit of background for you on this. In his witness statement to the High Court today, the Duke of Sussex claimed that tabloid newspapers painted a bad boy image of him and would try to coax him into living up to that image, describing those media practices as utterly vile. He also talked about the fact that he was in love with Chelsea Davy and it really hampered his relationship as well. Alex Phillips.
I don't think the word vindictive is right. I think it comes from a place of great pain. I mean, none of us know what it's like to have, walked even a metre in his shoes and be brought up in a goldfish bowl where everything that you're doing is being analysed and amplified and critiqued. And that must be incredibly difficult. But I do think in many respects it is ill-advised. And I think that the difficulty that Harry now faces is he's capitalised and cashed in on basically selling his privacy and the privacy of his relatives for millions and millions of pounds, and is now trying to make the case for privacy. And that is where the contradiction lies. I think to call Harry vindictive is probably not truly understanding what he's been through, but certainly the way he is behaving now is not actually helping to advance his case.
You're saying it'd be difficult to imagine walking a mile in here. I'd love to walk a mile in Prince Harry.
I don't know if you would, actually. I'm not sure.
Well, I do understand the point you're making about scrutiny and living in the public eye like a goldfish bowl and not being able to have any sort of relationships without the prying eyes of the press on you all the time. David Simmonds.
Well, you can't have it both ways, and I think that's what this has highlighted, that he's become a media celebrity. It's the basis of his wealth, his new lifestyle, and is then complaining about it. And, I wish him the very best. He said he wants to be more of a private citizen. He wants to be focusing on being a dad. I wish him the best with that. But clearly, if he's going to do that successfully, being all over the British media continuously is not going to help that. So he probably needs to make a decision at what is the point at which he steps back from this, adopts the role that he says he wants to adopt, and enables the rest of us, frankly, to get on with our lives and our jobs, which are rather more important than following a bit of a celebrity circus.
But David, I understand, but to be fair to him, he's talking about things that happened before he decided to supposedly take a step back from the royal family. He's talking about things that happened years ago when he was growing up, when he was trying to have relationships with different kinds of people. So does he have a point about press intrusion? I know that they're public figures, but are there limits to the level and the lengths that the press will go to get a story?
He's 100% right, and a number of the things that are being talked about were criminal offences when they happened. And we've seen journalists being jailed. We saw the News of the World as a newspaper going out of business completely as a result of its involvement in phone hacking. So it's absolutely right where there's evidence that those things are worked through. However, this is one of those things which, in my view, would be better dealt with just behind the scenes, let them work through it in a business-like manner, deal with the issues, put them to bed, and enable him and everybody else to get on with their lives, rather than this being an ongoing part of a media circus that often feels like it's fueling that fire rather than helping to damp it down.
Rachel, let me just put this to you, which is Prince Harry was quoted today. He says, you start off as a blank canvas while they work out what kind of person you are and what kind of problems and temptations you might have. You're then either the playboy prince, the failure, the dropout, or in my case, the thicko, the cheat, the underage drinker, the irresponsible drug taker. The list goes on. He's got a fair point, hasn't he?
I think he has a lot of fair points to make in this. I completely disagree with much of what's been said so far. Look, I know people have very different opinions about the Sussexes, and, whatever your opinion about them, what he's trying to do here is raise awareness of a very grave issue that affects people far beyond, him and his high-end lifestyle, but affects a lot of regular people as well. And he's doing it because he can. Lots of people who've been vilified and abused by our gutter press cannot stand up in court and do what he's doing. Our press has that reputation of being in the gutter for a reason. The way it treats people in this country, the way it can pounce on someone and destroy their lives, the hacking scandal for which there was never really a legal reckoning, for which there were no legal consequences for the media, for the gutter press.
We had Leveson, though.
Yes, and what happened after that?
Well, they are. It's a fair point.
So I think that he's doing this because he can. And the consequences go far beyond him. It's going to affect far more people and actually the state of our democracy.
You think it's his life's work now? Did you think he sees it as his mission now to do this?
You know, maybe. I think he has a lot of missions. You know, some of them are personal, some of them are political, some of them are, you know, wider purpose. And I think this is one of them. The texture of the way the media deals with stories and public and the right to a public life and also politics massively needs to change. It is doing us a massive disservice. And I think he is doing the public a service in bringing this to light.
Well, it's an interesting point. I mean, I think this the trial's going to run, and we'll see what comes out from it. But I think he's raising some very interesting points, and he's the first royal in over 100 years to take the stand in a court trial. So it's going to be fascinating to watch. Our next question is a text question from Albert. No, not from Albert. Jane in Cheltenham, rather, who says even the Brexiteers can't agree about how Brexit should be done now, with Kemi Badenoch hitting back at Tory MPs wanting a bonfire of EU laws by saying she's not an arsonist. Is Brexit anything other than a farce now? Well, given the fact that Kemi Badenoch's been mentioned here, David, I've got to come to you.
Well, Brexit was always all things to all people. I think what this has demonstrated as the government, as Parliament's begun to get to grips with it, is that we need to, again, to work through this properly. And we've seen the EU retained law bill, which this refers to, that as government initially proposed, let's just repeal everything. And then, of course, business came along and said, well, if we do that, that affects our ability in particular to export goods to key markets across the world. There's a huge impact on the economy of the United Kingdom if we do that, particularly if we do it without having put clear plans in place for what the successions would be. So I think Kemi has done exactly the right job. She's gone away and said, what are the things that we think we can get rid of that won't have that big negative economic impact? What are the things that we should be proceeding with? And of course, key slogan that was put forward in the Brexit referendum was about take back control. So the idea that you would return control to Parliament in Westminster and then delegate it all to be done out of sight, out of mind by ministers without Parliament having any kind of scrutiny role of it was clearly never going to be acceptable.
But they did say that they were going to abolish the 4,000-odd laws, and they're not doing that. They're abolishing fewer than that. I mean, 700 odd, I can't remember what the number is, but it's certainly not 4,000. Do you think that this is actually going to damage Kemi Badenoch's leadership chances? Because we all know that she wants to be leader of the party.
Well, she may well, but I think we've got to think about what's in the interest of the British people. And in my view, Rishi Sunak's absolutely spot on with this. This is not about rhetoric. This is about what is in the interest of our economy. And when you've got British businesses, big exporting companies saying this is going to really hamper the work that we are doing, selling goods to key markets across the world, if we simply abolish these regulations so our customers don't really know whether our products meet those standards, that has a major impact on our economy. So we need to make sure that we are making decisions case by case in the interests of the British people, and that those decisions are made under the scrutiny of the Parliament in the United Kingdom, as was promised at the time of the referendum.
Alex Phillips, former Brexit MEP. Is Brexit anything other than a farce?
I wish it was. No, do you know what's interesting? And I'm going to disagree with David here. I do actually think the retained EU law bill was rhetoric. It was a gimmick, because they're finding 4,000 regulations down the back of the sofa when you've got hundreds of thousands which have been implanted into UK statutes. And actually, you know, talking about going on a case-by-case basis and sectorally, if you look at the news out just today about foreign investment in the City of London in the financial services sector, that was one area where we had no deal with the EU, no deal whatsoever. And so the government got together and said, right, what do we do to boost growth in this sector? And they came up with the Edinburgh reforms, and that's attracted a lot of business. Now, when you look at the car manufacturers saying we're stuck between a rock and a hard place, they're actually pointing at the withdrawal agreement, which I know extremely well. And the problem with the withdrawal agreement is, on one hand, it stops under extant EU competition regulation the UK government being able to put a lot of taxpayer-funded subsidy and finance into critical sectors. And at the same time, in that withdrawal agreement, it demands that on a growing basis, year by year, cars produced in the UK have UK or EU-based components. But if we can't subsidise things like creating big battery plants for new electric vehicles, and then you have to get those components from China, we are then stuck with only being able to export to the EU with tariffs. And actually what the car manufacturers were saying is Brexit isn't necessarily the problem, it is the lack of an ambitious post-Brexit industrial strategy. So
we're not taking advantage of the Brexit. The Brexit dividend has not arrived.
I really don't think we are. Right, and I think that there are so many opportunities that we could take, as has been, I think, exhibited with what's gone on in financial services, that we should be looking at future-proofing other markets.
Rachel, do you disagree?
I mean, you're never, ever going to get people who supported Brexit to say there's anything... I mean, it's so ideological. It's like an ideology.
We're all Brexiteers now, aren't we?
That has no contact with reality. So whenever you present them with reality, it's like, oh, well, it wasn't done right, or wasn't done far enough, or no, this bit was wrong, that bit was wrong. It's never actually the Brexit that was wrong. That is the definition of a fundamentalist, by the way. And I just think that what we're seeing in the UK is this just slow decline. Some things are nothing to do with Brexit. Some things absolutely are to do with Brexit, and some things are made worse by Brexit. And it's this combination of all those three things that has got Britain in this kind of horrible, and it's just become faded and downward, in a downward spiral. Everything is worse. And you just think, well, how on earth are we going to pull out of this, the slowest recovery in the G7, when Brexit keeps exerting this drag, not just in terms of economic reality, but in terms of the political reality of it constantly obsessing the Conservative government, who do nothing in the public interest, by the way, when it comes to Brexit. Yep. All it does is feed this big spat that you're having and taking the country down with us while you're having it.
Alex, faded, a downward spiral, worse.
I totally agree, and I actually think part of the managed decline was giving up sovereignty and giving up bespoke personal ambition on behalf of the country to an entity that can't think in terms of what's best for the British people. And what the British people voted for very clearly, whether it's regarding immigration, agriculture, whether it's regarding manufacturing, what they wanted was a parliament that is energised and suddenly says, we have our hands on the levers of power and we're now going to work for you, the British people, and not essentially co-opt that work to unnamed faces and unelected bureaucrats in Brussels. It's very clear. And yes, of course, a transition this large, realpolitik comes to bear. But like I said, just today, when you look at the great success story of the City of London because we've left the EU, then I say, why cannot we replicate that with an innovative, creative, ambitious Britain first policy agenda to move us into the 21st century? Well, the EU is a declining market by GDP globally. That is undeniable. And we need to be thinking far greater than just allying ourselves within the confines of Europe.
Well, you made the point very strongly. And the consensus is broken out on the panel here in terms of, well, David's got to try to find line, of course, but general consensus that Brexit hasn't really delivered on either side. No one's really particularly happy about it at the moment. So if you want to get a question into our panel on Cross Question, you know what to do. Call 0345 6060 973. You can text on 84850. You can ask Alexa to send a comment to LBC. You're listening to Cross Question on LBC at 8:32. The news headlines with Charlotte Morgan.
The Duke of Sussex has told the High Court newspaper articles about his life have cost him friendships and led to tensions with his family. Prince Harry believes his phone messages have been hacked by Daily Mirror journalists since he was a teenager, something its publishers deny. A state of emergency has been declared in Ukraine, where a dam in the Russian-controlled region has been blown up. Both sides are accusing each other of destroying the hydroelectric structure. And a shock merger has been announced, boosting Saudi Arabia's involvement in elite sport. The PGA, DP World and Saudi-backed Live Golf Tours will combine their commercial businesses into a new company. LBC weather, the odd spot of drizzle in the far north of Scotland overnight, dry and clear elsewhere with a low of 5.
This is LBC. Cross Question on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
You're listening to Cross Question on LBC. It's 8:36, and I'm joined by a stellar panel comprising Rachel Shabi, the journalist and author, who, by the way, Ian Dale, who I'm sitting in for, ranked as, back in 2017, number 30 in the top 100 most influential people on the left, which was a big upscale. I'm still surprised, Rachel, that it wasn't number one, because we've been on many panel discussions together, and you always get the better of me.
I was robbed. Very generous of you to say.
There's always next year with Ian and the lists. David Simmonds, Conservative MP for Ruislip, Northwood and Pinner, where I actually grew up in Ruislip, and David and I have known each other for a very long time. We were both elected as councillors back in 1998 at the same time. How are you enjoying Parliament, David?
It's a fascinating place, and it's great to be able to contribute on the national scene. Yep. I know certainly you and I learned a lot about politics together. We did. As new entrants to that world. And it's great that we're still in touch.
Indeed. And you're also on the 1922 committee, so you have a lot of power when it comes to...
Far less than you do in the media, I think, Ali.
Indeed. And Alex Phillips, policy advisor for Reform UK and former Brexit MEP. Are you enjoying being in the Reform Party now?
Yeah, and, I love it, and it's a constant work of frustration, though. It's a labour of love. It's being in politics for absolutely the right reason, not for glory, but for wanting to change things.
Indeed, indeed. Well, the next question comes from... I think it's Anthony in Staines, actually. Anthony, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, good evening, Ali, and good evening, panel. Here's my question. Could a midsummer reshuffle save Rishi Sunak's sinking government?
Alex.
I am so over reshuffles. Have we not shuffled around enough? I mean, I was listening to a comedy programme the other day and someone said a year, otherwise known as, 3 different prime ministers and a change of monarch. I mean, it is, you do feel like there's constantly chopping and changing at the top. And I actually think if you want policy to bed in, if you want civil servants to work properly with the government leader, with the cabinet minister, then constantly reshuffling doesn't help that. It doesn't help you build a legacy. And we've now had 13 years of Conservative government and not much legacy to show for it, because the huge difference between the Cameron years and then the Boris Johnson period, the Liz Truss accident and now Rishi Sunak, there doesn't seem to be a forward compelling motion of travel. And I think that's all down to this constant changing of leadership and constantly changing the agenda. What I would quite like to see, whichever government we have next, is a bit of continuity and sticking to an ideology to see if it's actually going to work.
Do you think the quality of people who are going into Parliament, I mean, you've been involved in various parties, as I said before, and run for office. Do you think the quality of people going into public office is where it needs to be?
Do you know what I do think is now so much of our politics is dominated by graduates from a certain background, and what we've very much lost is the working class voice and working class representation. People who really get that, not just people who sort of say I've got some sort of heritage from a working class background, but actually now I've made good and I went through the university system and I worked in Goldman Sachs or as a PR person or whatever. But someone who really actually is that and stands up for it. What we have lost, and actually if you look at the statistics of representation in Parliament, even in the Labour Party, you've now got fewer than 20 MPs who one could consider categorically working class, and yet that's supposed to be the party that represents them. Yep. What I would like to see is broadening that and actually having a more open house and not just having a load of suited professionals.
And more people from Gloucester as well, probably.
Oh yeah, Jane and Cheltenham though, we had differences in politics, but I consider her a neighbour.
Indeed. David, look, he's 14 points behind at the moment, Rishi Sunak. He was doing quite well, but everything's going, all the metrics are going in the wrong direction. He's an ex-banker, focuses on key performance indicators. They're not going well.
Well, I think when we look at what the Prime Minister has set out in terms of priorities, what he's talking about are the things that matter to the country, and that people will see making a difference in their day-to-day lives.
But will a midsummer reshuffle help?
And I'm not convinced. I agree with Alex on this point. I think people are a bit sick of politics being like a drama series. They want the government getting on with the job. And Rishi Sunak, yeah, you could say it's quite a boring thing, but as you and I know from our local government background, sometimes having boring politics that makes a really good, positive difference that people see and feel in their lives is exactly what the voters want.
But you've also got to sell a vision, haven't you? You've got to captivate people.
I think it's very clear, particularly after the period that we've been through. We've had the COVID pandemic. We've obviously had all the rows that went on in politics about Brexit just before that. Then we've had a cost of living crisis driven almost entirely by Putin's decision to invade Ukraine and the economic consequences that's had. So I think most voters recognise that the government is dealing with a fairly unusual, pretty much unprecedented set of challenges. And what they want to see is that they've got a government that is focused, has the right instincts on what are the things that really help the economy, what are the things that put more money in people's pockets. The economy is the thing that overwhelmingly makes the difference to the vast majority of people's quality of life, and that is exactly what Rishi Sunak is doing.
So no reshuffle, and what about a change of leader? I have to ask, you're on the 22 committee,
no,
come on.
I don't see any prospect of that. And I think it comes back to this point. People are a bit sick of the drama. What they want to see is, after a period where British politics has been paralysed by divisions over Brexit initially, then about response to the COVID pandemic, lots and lots of people arguing and shouting and refusing to work together. They want a sense that government and Parliament is focused on what are the needs of the country at this time, how are we going to deliver that? And as a Conservative, what I believe is that we should be approaching things in the right way. We should approach sound financial management of the country. We want to make sure that the economy is prioritised, because that makes the big difference to people's quality of life, and it funds public services that others may depend on. Those are the things that will make the long-term difference to the quality of life of people in this country, and I think that is what we should be thinking about.
Rachel, do you think a midsummer reshuffle can save Rishi Sunak's premiership?
I don't think anything is going to save Rishi Sunak's premiership. And I think, look, you've had 13 years to do all those things that you've said you want to do. They're just words. And people are not idiots. You say, oh, this is unprecedented, pandemic, Ukraine war. We can see that other countries have a quicker recovery. What's the factor that other countries don't have that we have? It's you lot. That's the thing that's making our recovery sluggish and the worst in the G7.
But isn't he doing better, Rachel? Whatever you think. I mean, and it has been a very turbulent period, let's put it politely, in British politics. We're on our third Prime Minister since the last election now.
Third Conservative Prime Minister.
Indeed.
I mean...
No, indeed.
We didn't vote for two of them, by the way.
That's also true. But do you not think he's actually restored some stability and respect to the office? Sorry, it's a no bars. sorry.
I don't even know. Is that a serious question? Are you seriously asking me, do I think that he's performed the bare minimum of competence when compared to Boris Johnson? I mean, seriously, that's not even a bar, is it?
It's a fair point. I wouldn't have expected you to say anything out there. David, you want to come back?
I think when we look at what's going on in the economy, and in particular the fact that we've got a very, very high level of employment, that in constituencies like mine across the rest of the country, that's helping households, it's helping people to get through the financial challenges. We have a lot less people dependent upon benefits than we did. There's been a transformational change in that side of the economy. We've seen a great development in new industries, new technology, progress around net zero. We are way ahead of the G7, indeed way ahead of the G20 in the extent to which we are reducing our carbon emissions per capita through the government's policies. And of course, going into the COVID pandemic, we had a much, much less debt as a country than the Conservative government had inherited from Labour. Due to that painful austerity
Rachel,
period,
you're not buying.
we were in a stronger position going into that than we've been before.
Oh, it's pathetic. I mean, you know, because you live in this world, you live in Britain, you know what people are dealing with every single day, and you know that what you've just said has got zero contact with the reality that people experience every day. Look, there's no way that we can do anything useful to people in a country with the most rampant level of wealth inequality. And by the way, all the Conservatives have been for the last 13 years is a wealth delivery system to your mates and the richest in this country, hence the wealth disparities that have widened over 13 years. You've got to redistribute wealth. You've got to not attack, but you've got to tax wealth. You've got to tax unearned wealth.
Well, that's going to be...
And the only way you're going to actually make any difference in the economy is if you do that. You won't do that because your mates and your donors don't want you to.
Well, it'll be an interesting point when we'll see what happens with Keir Starmer's tax policy. Anthony, very quick comment from you on what you've heard.
Yes, well, Rachel made me laugh because I think it's the truth, but I do worry about Rishi Sunak with his connections with water, swimming pools, barges, and scrambling around on that boat yesterday in those boots. So, I'm really worried for him.
Well, to be fair to him, he was on a rigid inflatable boat and he was out there going and seeing what was doing. I mean, I thought he was applauded by the Coast Guard for actually wanting to do that. But Anthony, do you think it will save him quickly?
No, I think he's got too many people eyeballing his job. Boris, Jeremy Hunt, and the Home Secretary.
I think there are a lot more than those, actually, Anthony. But anyway, thank you very much indeed for your call. So you're listening to Cross Question on LBC. Still time to get a comment or a call in if you want. 0345 6060 973. Text on 84850. Ask Alexa to send a comment to LBC. This is Cross Question on LBC. It's 8:46.
This is LBC. Cross Question on LBC. Text 84850.
It's Ali Miraj on Cross Question with my splendid panel. Rachel Shabi, the journalist and author, David Simmonds, the Conservative MP, and Alex Phillips, the policy advisor for Reform UK and a former Brexit MEP. Our next question is a text question from Andy in London. After scientists found that the COVID lockdowns had a negligible impact on actually saving lives from the virus, do the panel think they were a mistake and did more harm than good? Now, just a bit of background here. Researchers from Johns Hopkins University in the US and Lund University in Sweden compared the strict lockdown measures in England and Wales with much more relaxed measures in Sweden and concluded that the deaths saved were a drop in the bucket compared to the staggering collateral costs imposed, and that lockdowns were a policy failure of gigantic proportions. David Simmonds.
The figures that they analysed suggested that it saved around 1,700 lives in the UK, and clearly if you were one of those 1,700 or a relative, this would be pretty important to you. But as a Member of Parliament who voted for the government's policy on this, I think it was always clear we were doing it on balance simply because at the time the science couldn't give us any definitive answer. And we looked at what was going on in countries like Sweden, where they had a more relaxed lockdown, and what was clear that there were also a lot of things that were different to do with things like population density that were influencing that. So we have to act in good faith in the light of the information that we have. What I'm hoping will come out of this is good information that can be used in future so that we know when faced with whatever the next kind of pandemic is, that we've got a better idea of how to make the right decision.
It's a serious business, Alex Phillips, locking down an economy. I mean, it's a huge thing to do. Do you think it did more harm than good?
Yes, I fundamentally do. And I opposed lockdowns from the beginning. That's not to say I had a murderous instinct and I wanted the vulnerable to be mingling with people and putting themselves at risk. But I always thought the blanket approach was fundamentally going to be a disaster. And yes, you can quantify the lives that might have been saved by lockdown. But what's very difficult to enumerate is all of the harms. And that also costs lives, actually, when people find themselves in economic deprivation, when people who are old and can't see relatives, and that sort of sense of loneliness actually often propagates an earlier fatality. And now you've got undiagnosed cancers and things like that. That is very hard to quantify. But what I do have sympathy with is this was a completely novel virus and nobody knew what they were doing. And the fact that the government went very much on the side of caution is not to be criticised and not to be blamed, because it wasn't done with the intention of creating this awful, post-lockdown symptom of economic malaise and so on and so forth, and undiagnosed illnesses. It was done with the right intention. But personally, I was always very sceptical of lockdowns and thought that actually shielding the vulnerable and allowing those... I mean, I'd had COVID extremely early on, like back in February before we even locked down. And I felt really, hampered by the fact I couldn't go out and be productive and be contributing to the economy, even helping other people, quite frankly. But it's all very well saying these things in hindsight. What I do hope is lessons are learned. And what we mustn't do is actually say, well, COVID's finished now. That was in the past. Let's forget about it. This COVID inquiry is going to be so important for learning lessons for the future.
Alex, let me ask you. I remember when Boris Johnson was standing up there and said right at the beginning of this pandemic that be prepared to lose your loved ones before their time. And a shiver ran down my spine when he said that at that point. Right. I thought, what?
We were terrified.
Yes.
I remember being terrified.
Exactly.
I remember being terrified those first 3 months. And at that point, I'd had COVID and hadn't realised it was COVID. I was like, why can't I smell anything? Why can't I taste anything? And so we were all terrified. And I think it's very easy to forget that. But certainly, I think after the first 3 months, I think that, as a journalist, I was closely following what other countries were doing. I was fascinated by the Sweden model. Yes. But I did think there was a lot of public and media browbeating as well, because everyone was pushing for harder and stronger and faster regulations. Yes. And it's almost like the other side was considered a sort of wacky tinfoil hat minority view when it should have been given a bit more thought.
Rachel, what do you think? Do you think that it was, given the fact they had a negligible impact, these lockdowns, that it was worthwhile?
I don't think that's a fact yet. I think that's the result of one survey, one study, which I will take with a pinch of salt. I think it's absolutely correct what other panellists have been saying, that there was an untold harm. I think it's still unknowable and unquantifiable, the impact of those 3 years have had on us as a society, but, individually, mental health, other forms of health, economy, livelihood, all the rest of it. Yeah. And at the same time, I think that it's worth remembering that a lot of the damage of the lockdowns was because the government locked down too late. It went against scientific advice several times and locked down slower than we needed to. And so the profound hardships that, we experienced to varying degrees, but, by the third one, we're all pretty fed up and miserable with it, was a consequence of government mismanagement. And I think it's important to remember that.
Do you think they should go harder and quicker?
Harder and quicker. And the other thing that's important to remember is that we went into it badly as a country because we have a welfare state that was battered, absolutely stripped to the bone by this government with austerity measures. And so all the things that should and could have protected us against this, the lockdowns and the pandemic, a welfare state, respecting and paying frontline workers for the work, the incredible work that they do, protecting those who are at the sharp end of the economy. All of those things we didn't have, and so it was worse.
Well, I think they may come out in the COVID inquiry, because apparently George Osborne's going to be questioned about this, isn't he? About the austerity measures and the backdrop and the run-up to COVID and underinvestment in public. So that's all may come out in the discussion. Interesting question, Andy. Thank you for that one. Molly in Dundee has got another text question. Ian Blackford is standing down from Parliament, and the SNP might soon have to fight a by-election as well. Are they losing their grip on power? Now, the SNP's former leader in Westminster, Ian Blackford, announced this afternoon he's going to stand down. He's not going to be standing at the next election. Meanwhile, the independent MP, Margaret Ferrier, who was formerly an SNP MP, was kicked out of the party because she was suspended and has been suspended by the Commons for 30 days for breaking for the very rules that we were just talking about, the COVID lockdown rules. She will now face a recall petition which could trigger a by-election in her seat of Rutherglen and Hamilton West, where Labour would hope to challenge the SNP to win the seat. So this could be actually a very interesting point for the SNP versus a resurgent Labour Party, David.
A resurgent Labour Party, and indeed the Conservatives, who are in a strong position in Scotland as well. I think the fact that Rishi Sunak as Prime Minister has been quite proactive in setting out how he wants to work with the Scottish Government, and indeed the devolved Assembly in Wales and in Northern Ireland once it comes back into operation, which I think reflects a confidence that the devolution settlement in the UK can be got going again. Now, the politics of this is clearly very complicated. You know, the SNP essentially has become a single issue party. The only thing that they talk about is how Scottish independence would help them to address everything. Scottish independence means they wouldn't have left the European Union. Scottish independence means they'd have done different things on COVID. They might even have closed the border with England if it enabled them to do that during the pandemic. Now, clearly, the question is then going to be from voters who are looking at what's going on with the cost of living. Why is it that the NHS in Scotland is performing worse than it is in England, despite the fact that the SNP government has tax-raising powers? Why is it that the education system in Scotland is falling behind that in England?
Well, happens the use of
all of those things are going to be challenged they've got to face. Yeah, and they'll need to show either that they have answers to that, or the voters will begin that process of looking at solutions from other political parties.
Alex Phillips, is it all over for the SNP? Is it looking dire?
Well, it's interesting, isn't it, the sort of grand fall from power. And I think what this reflects is what happens when the health internally in a party isn't good, that eventually it starts to show externally.
Doesn't it show dominance by one person as well? Is never good for a party.
This is it. I still want to know why Nicola Sturgeon's garden was being dug up. I mean, no one told us what that was about. But, you know, there was a lot of talk above the border of, you know, what quite was going on in the SNP and things being swept under the carpet and so on and so forth. And it seems that the hens have really come home to roost. Yep. And actually, I disagree actually in the sense that they're a single issue party, because arguably one thing that had a big shift when it came to the popularity of the SNP was them striding straight forward into the culture wars. That really changed a lot of people's opinions. But, you know, they definitely have a battle on their hands. They've basically run Scotland like a one-party state. I don't think many Scottish people are really seeing the dividends of SNP leadership, and I'd imagine the Labour Party are rubbing their hands together with glee, because that is basically for them to play for now.
Labour Party rubbing their hands with glee, Rachel?
Potentially, yeah. I mean, I do think that one of the problems with the SNP is that they became the establishment party.
Yes.
Right, because they were there for so long, and that was my impression, you know, speaking to people in Scotland of how and these would be people who supported the SNP. And by the way, I don't think it's at all, or was at all, about only being about Scottish independence. You know, a lot of the appeal of the SNP was on socioeconomic platforms that were very distinct from Labour, to the left, but distinct from Labour. Now, what that turns into now, I don't know, especially with what we were talking about before, about all the parties converging into the centre and all looking the same. I wonder if a casualty will be, you know, the sort of voter apathy that I certainly worry about with England as well. Indeed.
Now, the fun question, always my most enjoyable part of the whole entire evening. This is from Samuel in Barnstable. He says, stats show that kids are ditching playing the recorder, teachers are blaming the pandemic and fears of spreading viruses. Which instrument did you play at school? Did any of you keep playing it into adulthood? Alex Phillips.
Well, I started off on the recorder, the gateway drug, if you will, and I think long live the recorder because when you're 5 years old, you can play Three Blind Mice. It feels like a grand achievement. I then was introduced to the piano. My brother was an absolute maestro and got to grade 8 by about the age of 12 or something. And it took me up until the age of 18 to just get to grade 5. I have a piano in my house. I do sometimes play it, normally when I'm a few tequilas down and think I'm probably going to sound good. Yeah. But I did have an intermediate period on the violin, and that's not recommended unless you're musically very good.
Indeed. David Simmonds.
I have no musical talent whatsoever, but like Alex, I started out with a recorder. I think it was compulsory when I was at school. I can say from personal experience, children are certainly learning it today, as I hear it quite a lot in my home as well. But these days, I remain in awe of your DJing skills. I think that's the pinnacle of musical achievement.
Indeed. Rachel.
I do think, I also played the recorder. I do think it's quite an unpleasant instrument to listen to because it is quite, screechy, tonally screechy. But yeah, I also played piano and did that total university cliche thing of playing a bit of guitar then. Yeah. But I actually really loved playing the piano, and if I had room for one, I definitely would.
Well, I would recommend you all take up DJing. SL1210 Technics are the best, or Pioneer CDJ 2000 Nexuses. You can't go wrong. What a fantastic panel we've had. I'll explain later offline, Rachel. Fantastic panel. Thoroughly enjoyed the discussion. Thank you very much indeed to Rachel, to David and to Alex for joining me this evening. Now, coming up, should actors play roles only if they share the particular characters and the particular characteristics of the characters they represent? This is something that has been brought up by Michael Sheen. He's actually said, he's been born in Port Talbot, he's Welsh, as you know. He's saying, seeing people playing Welsh characters who are not Welsh, I find it's very hard for me to accept that. He also says that he finds it quite difficult that people from quite privileged backgrounds, for them to play compelling roles when playing characters from working class backgrounds. So should actors only be cast for roles if they share the identities and the characteristics of individuals they play?
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
Leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 9 o'clock. Prince Harry has spoken of his hostilities with the press, accusing tabloid press of being utterly vile. The Duke of Sussex has told the High Court he's lost friendships because of paranoia caused by unlawful tactics of gathering information. He's today been cross-examined in his phone hacking case against the publishers of The Mirror. Royal commentator Caroline Frost has told LBC he's not holding back.
He is obviously in the nothing to lose bin these days. He calls himself as a soldier that wants to uphold good values. He sees himself on a crusade to right the wrongs of the British press, not just recently, but over the last 20 years.
The MGN Group denies hacking Prince Harry's voicemail to help them generate content. Villages have been flooded, residents have been evacuated and crops have been swamped after a dam in the Dnipro River in Ukraine was destroyed. Moscow denies it's to blame, while US intelligence